Thanks everyone for coming out to the Logical Advantage Lunch and Learn today. I am, of course, Mark Wilson, Senior .NET Developer here at Logical Advantage. And today we're going to talk about using jQuery to build Windows Store applications. We're going to spend the first part of this talk, or this lunch, talking about the fundamentals that you need to understand in order to build a standards-based app using HTML and JavaScript for Windows Store apps. We're going to talk a lot about security context, because this is a thing that you're going to fight and struggle and bang your head against your keyboard with, because there are some things that are different that you're accustomed to doing it one way currently on the web, and you can't exactly do it that same way within a Windows Store app. And then we're going to dive into some specifics with using jQuery, and we'll end out with some tips and tricks and pragmatic advice that we can all take home for when we start our next Windows Store project for whichever customer we're working on. So, a little bit of history. There has been, since Windows Store applications were first announced back in mid-September 2011 at Build 2011. Everyone was kind of like, does it work, does it not work? You have this ability to use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So for about a little more than a year time between the two build conferences, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, most of the time it didn't work. You had to do a lot of things to get jQuery to work. Then on the last day of build, and they should have highlighted this in the keynote if you ask me, but on the last day of build they had a session where some folks from Microsoft and Pen2 introduced a jQuery for Windows 8. Now, this was, for all intents and purposes, a fork of jQuery 1.8 that they had gone through and fixed or modified jQuery code to not do the things that a Windows Store app prefers you to not do. So as of, it was actually published on October 31st, things got a lot better. And then just recently on April 18th, jQuery 2.0 was released, and all of those changes that were in the jQuery for Windows 8 version got rolled into jQuery 2.0, along with all the other changes that, of course, the jQuery Foundation announced. So, let's see what you can do today. We'll do a quick little demo here. This is Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows 8. This is the free version that anybody can download. You only have to pay for Windows 8 or ask our wonderful CTO for a key. Let's do a new project, a simple blank application. And for those of you who might not have seen this before, you naturally have a nice little template that has a default page. It has some default JavaScript, which launches the application. You have some logos, and of course some CSS. And we'll just play this. I've not made any modifications. And you can see application starts up and the page loads. Content goes here is all that's on the page. Now, let's add a reference to jQuery. And I downloaded the latest version, 2.0.2. We're going to add it in there. And then we're just going to add the script tag. And when we ran the app the first time, as you can see, there was one little comment when the application was running that it loaded some script code. Now let's see what happens when all we've done to the app, no, not referenced jQuery, just added it in a script link. Application starts, same as it did. We have no JavaScript console errors that have been logged, but if you note, we have two exceptions that were captured by the JavaScript runtime. And these are minor issues that they didn't blow up the runtime, they didn't blow up your application. But this present version of jQuery still has some references that Windows Store apps don't particularly like, or Windows 8 doesn't particularly like. The first one, for example, is a check if you're running Opera, if you're running this app in Opera. So I'm sure there's still going to be a little bit more work, hopefully in a future version, to get these errors out. But as you can see, it works with some caveats. And just for good measure, let's actually reference jQuery in a hello world case. We have a paragraph with an ID of demo, and what I want to do is change this text in here to just replace it with hello world. Just to prove, yes, it does work.
Starts up pretty fast.
Pardon?
Starts up pretty fast.
Yes, it does. Yes, thank you, thank you. That's all you need to know. If only it was that simple.
Mark, can we make the resolution a little higher?
On the
We're blind.
Just make the zoom inside the editor bigger anyway.
Maybe
I don't think we can do much about the rest of this.
yeah. I did.
Fonts and colors don't pop up.
Thank you. I made this bigger when it was 1024 by 36. We'll try. Is that better?
Yeah.
Can you see it in the back? Okay, sure.
They shouldn't do that by font size, they should do it by age.
That would be nice.
We need a set of themes by age.
Okay, so as you can see, the key thing that Microsoft wants you to understand and know is that Windows Store apps can be built using standards-based HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I kind of gave you a very elementary introduction. Yes, it does work.
Because just, you can use standard stuff, just don't check the C options.
Yes. Well, the key is standards-based. You can see this over and over again. Because Windows Store apps support most CSS5 features. They support most HTML5 features, most CSS3 features. And for all intents and purposes, it really is like building a website and targeting IE10 in standards mode. Again.
Can we get in trouble with that in 2001 with IE4?
Writing
everything for IE?
Yes. Well, you naturally don't build a website targeting one particular browser, or at least you shouldn't.
Unless it's IE6.
Yes.
You have to support that because that's what your enterprise is.
So the reason behind this statement is essentially you are running in IE10. The Windows Store app is running on the Trident layout engine and running in the Chakra JavaScript engine. Now, one thing to note, this is IE10 Chakra version is only the Amansa script 5, which was released or written back in December 2009. Please remember this is 2013.
Yeah.
I am hoping that at build in a week or two, they will announce that the next version of IE will at least support 5.1, which came out in 2011. If not, at least the 2 other newer drafts that are out there.
That's Windows 8.1, right?
Yes. Yes. For
So it's
Windows
got a new
8.1.
version of IE.
Yeah, it's IE 11.
Yes. But have they announced what?
No, I don't, they haven't announced release
I don't think
specs,
they've
no.
gotten to the specifics yet. So, some other changes. This is a list of everything, or most everything, that was added from IE9 to IE10. So, all of your transforms, Flexbox, and CSS grid have been added. So, we've got a lot of good stuff. This is kind of the framework that you can play around in. But as we all know, an application is not the same as a website. And this is particularly true for a Windows Store application. It has a different application model. There is the concept of suspending and terminating and being able to save or persist data differently than you do with a typical web app. There's a difference, of course, in navigation. In the browser, you have the back forward buttons, you got the URL bar. You don't have that. The best way to describe a Windows Store application is it's a single page app. You can't pop open a new window or anything like that. You have a single page, you can navigate to a different page, but you're still only within that one window. Of course, Windows 8 applications give you some OS integration. You can have access to the actual file system, which of course you can't really do in a browser. There is different persistence models. There are ways to save data if you're on the Surface and share that data so that it appears on the Windows Phone. And the most important thing, and again the one that you end up hitting your head against the most, is trust. With all of these new features that you're being given, they still wanted to sandbox developers and applications to not violate the user's trust. So they do that by sandboxing application or the executable that you're running. On the web, it's iExplore, it's Chrome, Firefox, whatever. In a Windows Store app, you're running in WWA host. That in the browser, you have the web context. In a Windows Store app, you have a local context. That gives you the ability to reach down into the Windows RT APIs and thus gain access to the overall operating system or the things that they dispose in the operating system, such as tiles, contracts, PLM, things like that. But you're still developing HTML, CSS, JavaScript if you're using IE Trident and Chakra. It's the exact same engine running inside the WWA host executable. Like jQuery, Microsoft created WinJS, which has some common features to jQuery. There's ways to use selectors and different jQuery functions that everyone's familiar with. but it also wraps the Windows API calls to allow you to get to the goodness of Windows 8 apps. App data, like I said, you can get some roaming, you can save data out to roaming profiles and share that among instances and the same users' instances across devices. And if all else fails, or if you really want to, there's still a web context as well, where you can create an iframe or add an iframe and reference any web page that's out there that you choose to reference. But you do have to note these are running in separate contexts. You're not sharing a cookie or anything like that. So the tools and tricks that we are all familiar with for a website talking to an iframe, for example, post to an iframe, that's all you can do. So the same concepts are all you have available to you. A web context cannot call WinRT API calls. The app, you'll get an exception, and most likely the app will crash. So this is the world that Microsoft has created for us. And as long as you understand these sandboxes, you'll begin to understand some of the additional things that I'll cover in a minute about things that you can and can't do now once they've created this. So, any questions on this?
Where do we have XAML and C# in this?
XAML and C#, I do not know if those are running in WWA host or not, in all honesty. They might be, but I would not be surprised if they run in a different executable.
Yeah, they seem to discuss those as two totally different.
They do.
Even though you can build apps in both, they view them as two totally different things.
They do.
I don't think. So you can deploy C# XAML. You can do a WinStore app in Windows.
Yes. You can build apps that way. I don't know why you want to, but you can.
Yeah, well, Microsoft certainly doesn't promote it at all. They want you doing it this way, do their WinRAM stuff. They hardly ever talk about XAML, C#, Win8, WinStore apps. It's always oh, by the way, you can do that if you want. It's never this is how you do it. It's always oh, this is an option.
This
But
is
they
an
never
option
explain the
if
option.
you're familiar with it. Or C++.
Yeah.
You can build a WinStore app in C++. I haven't seen anyone give a good demo on there.
That's what raised all the.
XAML's dead.
Well, that's what raised all the concerns when they first showed this a year and a half ago, that they were showing, well, here's how you build a Win app, and they showed this.
Yes.
And everybody's like, well, where'd Silverlight go? Where's my C#? Where's XAML that you've been telling me is the greatest thing in the world, and now you totally don't use it anymore?
XAML group was moved into the Windows group out of the Elementary Tools group at about that same time. So it still exists. There's still a XAML group at Microsoft, but they're part of Core OS now instead of Visual Studio.
I think Silverlight will remain around, particularly for media functions.
Well, that's
We'll
full
see.
WPF, not just
Yeah.
Silverlight.
All right, so let's dig a little bit deeper now. Let me go over some documentation about the HTML and DOM API changes. And one of the things that I really want to commend Microsoft is their documentation for Windows 8 application development, I think, is the best that they've ever done. If I have ever run into a problem or a question, as long as I can find the document, and you might, sometimes challenging to Google it with Bing or
Bing
it with Google, or the other, which we can't say. But generally, there is a document that addresses the question somewhere. It's just a matter of finding it. So
The fun part is if you win, the Microsoft provides search, which knows Bing is behind it, and you can't find it, then you go out and do Google search and it finds it.
And it finds it perfectly. Yes, that's part of my complaint. All right, so we're going to start at the bottom because some of these, if you've done any amount of web development, you've played with window close, prompt open, things like that. Not supported. You cannot make these calls. As we move up the list, you'll see that particularly when we get to a very important one, inner HTML, which most of the time is the one call that you're using, the behavior has changed. And that's the case for a lot of calls documented on this page. The behavior has changed. It is either not allowed and they will throw an error message at you and crash your app, or they've wrappered it and modified it so that, for example, it might run through two static HTML first. So when you do it on the web, you're going to get one output and expectation, and when you run it in a Windows Store app, it's going to behave a little bit differently.
Is that where they had so many conflicts with jQuery?
Yes.
Because jQuery,
jQuery, just about all JavaScript libraries are using, inject this script or these DOM tags into your document.
I haven't used hardly at all any of this stuff anymore. jQuery provides me with something that does one of those, and then I don't have to worry about whether it's IE8 or whether it's Firefox or whatever jQuery handles. So I don't use these that much anymore.
All the hipsters are moving back to it though.
Pardon?
All the hipsters are moving back to doing the low-level calls.
Going old school.
Yes. Yes. Well, because
Just quote
it
unquote
is
fast.
still faster to make the direct call that the JavaScript runtime recognizes.
But I mean, we're building an application. You can't expect everything. I mean, we're not building a website. We're building an application. It's pretty damn close, which should be amazing in itself that you can actually build an HTML5 application that runs as a desktop app.
Well, it comes down as really preference, because the argument about, well, I'm going to reuse or use similar code between this and website doing it just didn't happen because they're two different contexts.
But the
But
view
if
should
you're
always be
comfortable writing HTML5,
But the view should always be separated from the business logic anyway, right? It's just the view.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Should be.
Yeah.
If you do it correctly, it
Yeah.
will be separated.
Well, I didn't say it was one of the projects we're currently on.
All right. So there's a list out there, there's documentation. You're welcome to go view it, the rest of it. I just hit a couple highlights. Let's dig in and actually look at a little bit more substantial example or demo. There is a Hello World demo. If you're a complete beginner, I have a link at the end that will take you to the tutorials that Microsoft walks you through. And this is the code that you get if you follow their tutorials. Let me just run this so you can see what's here, and then we'll talk through the code. They have a little text box here that you can type in something, hit enter. and hello world is outputted. The WinJS has some new controls. This is one of the controls. It's a rating control. So as you can see, the stars light up as you hover, and as you pick one, the value gets sent back through, or can be sent back through an event, so that you know which one was selected. Pretty simple little demo here. Let's take a look at how they built that, and then what we are going to do is modify it to use jQuery. For the HTML, it's pretty simple. There's a container div with some paragraphs, a standard input, standard button. The new thing, the WinJS controls, these are some of the new features that you have the option of using. They are all defined by a data-win-control property, and it's contained within a div. So when the application runs, it first goes through this essentially launch JavaScript. Let me go back, sorry, to the default. It goes through here, and this call right here, when the app is activated, this promise, everything is async for Windows Store apps. So there's a promise that's set that will initialize all of those controls, those WinJS controls, if you choose to use them. And this is the line of code that actually converts that little div into the rating star that you had. So when this particular page loads on load event, let's process everything, and then once the page is ready, this is wiring up the rating control. So get element by ID, and for all the WinJS controls, for the rating, there's several others. The way you get a handle to them is by making this win control call. And of course, you can put this all in one line if you want. But I wanted to highlight. This is a little bit different, and later on you'll see that if you choose to use their controls, you'll be following this pattern. And then in this case, we're wiring up the change event whenever you click on one of the stars. So you're adding an event listener on change, and you're passing it the handler or the method that you wish to call.
Win control is just a prototype on the div control itself, correct?
Yes. Yes. The button, pretty standard. Go get it. You go get your button and add an event listener for click. Setting the DOM or setting the inner text or inner HTMLs, pretty much the same. Get element by ID. Create your string that you wish to set the value to. And since this is text, since there's no CSS or script or anything like that, go ahead and use the inner text. It will be a whole lot easier. And the stars does the same thing, but as you can see, it passes in, like I said, it passes in an event info. So then from the event info, you can get the detail of whatever the rating is, and that gives you your value.
So pretend the rating is, in case you want to roll it back, you could say .detail.cancel.
Yes. Yep. Yes, you could cancel it. All right. So now let's turn this into jQuery. HTML doesn't change. There's no modifications necessary, of course, with the exception of a reference to jQuery. Again, use the latest, you'll be a whole lot happier. 2.0.2 is the one that's out now. As far as the JavaScript goes, instead of window on load, we of course can do document ready. You still need to follow this, after you've processed everything on the page, then you still have, for WinJS controls, you still have to follow the same process. And I'll show you why in a minute. But for, of course, a standard button, you can wire up a click event or an on, whatever you so choose, whatever your preference is. Down when you're setting the actual output, instead of get element by ID, of course we can use the much more friendly $, pound, whatever your element ID is. Get its value, set the text, and then set it back using, again, keep things the same. If you're going to do inner text, then you can use the text property. So, we run this, and just same as before. Yes, and breakpoints do work. And the reason why I broke here is I want to show you the output that is created for the rating control. So you can see why you have to use their stuff. This is the div. They inject a lot of attributes, class, roles, various different things. They add in some divs, which are where the stars are, or what represent the stars. And then I believe this little div here is the little pop-up window right above the star. As you hover over it, it shows you the value. What's missing, of course, are IDs. There are no IDs. So if you're familiar with using other third-party controls, typically you have access to the parent, but you don't necessarily have access to what gets injected inside the parent or the container. But it still works. You can change this to anything. So you can see the logical and works same as follows. But as nice as this is following the Microsoft demo exactly. I have some complaints with this because it still is not following accepted standards. For example, separating your CSS at the top and your JavaScript references at the bottom. So just for good measure, I did it the way it should have been done in the demos, just to confirm that it worked. All the CSS at the top, all your JavaScript bottom, and in the jQuery, Microsoft does recommend using a self-invoking function in your JavaScript. One of the best practices when using self-invoking functions are to pass in your jQuery so that you don't get bit by third-party vendors who decide, that dollar isn't going to mean jQuery anymore. It's going to mean whatever we want it to be. And believe it or not, I have been bit by that by a national online survey company. They crashed my production app when they changed their JavaScript, that you reference, their process is to call their JavaScript on their server to make your function work. So they update their thing on their server without telling you, and now your application's blowing up and you don't know what the heck's going on. So, good practice. Now $, is exactly what I want it to be. Other than that, I just cleaned up everything else in the app, and all the comments are gone.
So you can't get rid of event listener change rating and change false. There's no way to jQueryify that one?
There is not an easy way to jQueryify that because it is this wing control.
So if you don't wrap it the way they want it wrapped, it's just going to fail.
Well, you can't. I've not found a way to add things to it or to modify it. Now, you do have, as you saw, all of the styling is classes. So if you want to change the star to be a banana, which I have seen somewhere, you can do that. You can change it to a degree, but the functionality is off of this wing control. That's how you get a handle to it.
If you deploy, you should get $100 from Microsoft.
Pardon?
You're getting $100 right now?
Yes, until the end of the month, if you get an app submitted and accepted, and I believe you have to have it accepted, you can get $100 back from Microsoft. That's until the end of the month. So, good little summary table here. In the local context, you do have access to the WinRT. In the web context, you don't. You will crash your app. WinJS, believe it or not, you can copy that and use that on any old website you want today. It's going to partially work, of course. It is intended for Windows Store apps, but there are things you can use. It's comparable to jQuery, really. It's got some duplicate features, it's got some exclusive features. Not exactly sure why you would do that, but anyway, it's partial. I'm going to show you in a minute JavaScript code. If you wish to inject within an attribute or via an attribute some code, the app, your Windows Store app is going to throw an error. And that's kind of that hint about the inner HTML. If you try to insert a script, it's not going to like you. It's not going to let you do that. Whereas, of course, you can do that today in any web app. Same with data URIs for fonts. If you so choose to go that way, not supported in the local context. And the one that is probably somewhat most frustrating originally, everyone, your practice is to reference a CDN to get jQuery or whatever framework you so choose or third-party package. You cannot reference those in a Windows Store app through a external script. Windows Store apps are meant to be offline, run locally, with your network turned off. So all of the scripts, as you saw, you have to download those, add them to the application, and then that gets packaged and installed when the user
But you can still do
chooses.
some HTTP, correct?
Yes. You can still call out, make AJAX calls to get data. Some people are actually using AJAX calls to get JavaScript back, and then they save that JavaScript and execute it that way. So there are some creative hacking that's taking place.
It could go away at any moment.
It could go away. I don't think that it will, particularly not the data. But it's a neat way to add features to an app. we'll see if that continues. Windows close. If you're in the web context of a Windows Store app, you cannot execute window.close. But Microsoft does say that if your application has a fatal error that it cannot recover from, and I have no idea what that would be, but if you get yourself in that state, you can call window.close to kill your Windows Store app, and it will work. And of course, since you are running this kind of in a local context, you can make calls out of your domain, which you haven't been necessarily able to do without opening up the security hole for the cross-domain, cross-site script. Because running locally, you got to go get your data from Azure or wherever you so choose to put it. But there is one back door, which I'm going to show you. If, through all of this, and everything that I've mentioned, all the documentation, if you just want the app to do whatever it is you ask it to do, trust me, I know what I'm doing, you can wrap your JavaScript code in this MS app execute unsafe local function
That's all right.
and get it to work. So if you have an inner HTML and you want to inject actual script, you can use this and it will work. So let's look at some of those things. Oops. We'll get to that.
So is it allowing eval on the script you're injecting?
Yes, if you use that. Yeah. Yeah. So I have a great little all right, so I have an ordered list with a series of list items that by default will show here. And in the JavaScript, let's walk through this. Okay, I've done this two different ways. The first way is the Microsoft way, where you get your element by ID. I put that in a little function to make the code a little bit more readable. So, get element by ID, list item 1, set the inner HTML to some text. And as I've mentioned, that will work. Same is true with injecting a little bit of DOM or HTML. We're going to inject a div in this case. That works perfectly fine. But let's try doing on-click. If you click on the div, it's going to call some function. That throws an exception. The exception that you get back is fairly descriptive, unable to add dynamic content. And basically it points you to the same doc that I showed you just a little bit ago on NSDN, pointing you to that doc saying you can't do whatever that function is that you're trying to do. If you do this, your app is going to crash.
Just did.
Well, I caught it, so it didn't crash. In this case, or in this example, let's try to do script. Actually add in script. No, you can't do that either. The attributes, the data attributes, data-custom, data-whatever, because everyone's using those now. Those are perfectly allowed. name. No, I've stopped using name eons ago, but name is one of those items or attributes that they do not let you use. So if you try to send in an attribute using name, it's going to throw an error. But an ID, naturally, everybody uses ID, that is allowed. So just for good measure, I did all of the same things again, but this time using jQuery. So text works, a div works, on click throws the same error, injecting script throws the same error, data dash custom attributes are allowed, name is not, ID works in F5. And as you can see, the third, fourth, and sixth one failed. But if you look below down in jQuery, you know what's missing or what's different. When it throws an error and you're using jQuery, you were still able to work, but it replaced the inner HTML with nothing. So my guess is when the error is thrown, it's passing back an empty string. A little something to note. That caught me off guard when I first saw that. So, as I hinted to it, let's see a real demo. Enough of this fun stuff. Let's try to get something truly fun working. There we go. My ultimate goal when I started out trying to learn how to build a Windows Store app using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. First was to get jQuery to working, and second, or more importantly, the end game was to get AngularJS working. So if you are familiar, or hopefully you guys have heard about this, the To-Do MVC website, this is the new Hello World, in my opinion. This website has Backbone, Angular, Ember, Knockout, Dojo, every JavaScript package that I think it has any prominence. They've created an example of a to-do application, an implementation using that framework. So in AngularJS, in this case, let me open this up in IE10, because there are some, of course, rendering differences between IE and Chrome. Again, Windows Store apps are essentially running IE10, or the engines of IE10. So you have a little to-do app. You can add items. You can complete them. The status is at the bottom, update. You can clear them out. You can show only what's completed or what's active and check everything out. So this is the example that was created through this todomvc.com. I took the code from this website, line for line, copy-pasted it into a Windows Store app. This is a fairly good example of if you've got an existing website, what can you do? So let's see. Minimize this, and all right. So again, file, new project, take a blank application, blank Windows Store application. The template that gets created, you have a default page. I replaced the content that's in the default page with the content that is in the to-do app, line for line. The only, I don't think I made any changes necessary to the HTML. I might have deleted, as you saw on the website, there was a little helper bar on the left-hand side. I've removed that because we don't need it. For the JavaScript, there is, Microsoft does create a default JS. I am ignoring that. I'm not referencing it. So this application is definitely not following best practices for a Windows Store app. It's not going to handle suspend and terminate and things like that. It's not saving data outside of what the to-do app is doing. So instead, we reference their base JS. I kept everything in here the same, with the exception that at the bottom of the JS file, again, I took out the things that were loading that helper bar, which they were doing dynamically. So the only thing that's really left in here right now is a light version or a subset of underscore.
I was going to say those.
Yeah, it's a kind of a light version of underscore. And that's the only thing that's still remaining in here. Didn't make any changes. I did reference in jQuery. For those of you that don't know, Angular has within its code a kind of a lightweight version of jQuery. And if you reference any jQuery version above their package, referencing their package in, they'll use whatever you use. So to help make things a little bit easier, I'm using the latest version of jQuery. Other than that, I copied their controllers, I copied their directives, I copied their services, I copied everything, including their CSS and the background PNG that they reference within the CSS. Made no other changes, started the application, and it crashed. And after much searching on the web, I found multiple sites that said the only way to get this working, and as I showed you, oops, unsafe, you wrap all of Angular in an unsafe local function. And as soon as you do that, ladies and gentlemen, I present you with a fully functioning and working application. It works just as you expect.
So that means you can do the same with Knockout, which is the problem of injecting
Well,
stuff.
yeah, in Knockout, I did see that people had some different comments about Knockout, particularly because Knockout does not rely on jQuery.
Right.
So they don't have that dependency. But yes, for a lot of third-party packages today, we'll see what build brings. There might be something new when the conference takes place. But to get the third-party JavaScript libraries functioning, you might have to wrap them in the unsafe. Now, if you do that, it is really up to you as the application developer to go through all of their code and make sure they're not doing something stupid. Because, I guarantee somebody out there is releasing some JavaScript file that's going to be able to go down, read your files, and copy it out to God knows where. Somebody will try to do that. But it's up to you as the developer to ensure that, hey, you've validated this is the functionality you want, and it works.
And they'll still approve it with the store app.
Pardon?
And they'll still approve it.
I think they will. Now, as long, with the caveat that whatever is in those packages aren't doing the explicit things that Microsoft does not allow. They do have checks that, I don't know, there's certain calls that you cannot make that raises red flags in their validation of your app. So, if those calls are made, red flags are going to be thrown, an engineer is going to get involved, they're going to look at it, and they'll probably reject your app. Saying, hey, you're making this call, you shouldn't be doing this, even though you drafted it. So, but, as you can see, this works. This is cut and paste, a little bit of removal of things that I didn't really care about or we didn't need, but this is the website running in a Windows Store application on the desktop. It works. Any questions on this? No? So.
There's no persistence in the demo, right?
Well, there is. The jQuery or the To-Do app does have a
Isolate local storage.
yeah local storage. So if I quit the app and I start it back up, it does remember my things. This is naturally not the preferred storage mechanism. It's kind of an excellent leadway into the rest of my presentation here. Building great Windows Store apps. Really, yes, I've taken the website, I've made it work, but now we need to enhance it. And one of those things is if you're doing local storage or whatever storage you're using in your website for offline browsing or stuff like that, you might want to consider changing that and using what Microsoft recommends within a Windows Store app. You're definitely going to want to add in the process lifetime management features. PLM, get used to that acronym. They talk about it a lot. That's the suspend, terminate, resume, the ability to have it run in the background and get data or something like that. You're going to want to add that to your application. You're going to want to be able to handle screen resizing and view state, the snap feature in Windows 8. And the screen, when you rotate your tablet, your Surface tablet, you're going to want to handle that. Now, as you saw, or might have seen in the CSS, they're using media queries. That's great. That's one very valid way to do it. I might argue that you might want to consider mobile first as a better approach, but it's something to consider. Contracts, Windows 8 contracts, of course, give you the ability to search into your application if that's applicable, or things like that. And of course, the live tiles and notifications. The Windows Store app on that wonderful start screen that everyone's going to love once they get over missing their start button. That interactivity, the refreshing of the tile, that you're going to add. You're going to want to add that. In addition, you might want to consider using WinJS controls. I showed you the rating control. There's a date picker. The number one, or the two most used controls, the list and grid view. That's particularly true. You're going to use the list view on the wide screen, and then when you snap it, you may convert into a grid view. You might consider using the animations. The application that I was using to demonstrate jQuery it was using just straight anchor tags, a href, go to this page. If you notice, it didn't have that rotation that you get, the little slide. There's a personality with Windows Store apps that you might want to consider adding in. And the way to do that is using the WinJS animations to enter and exit the page. So you get that nice little fluid motion. Same with commanding surfaces. The charms that come in on the right side, the app bar, either top or bottom, if you use that. You want to create things, put things, you consider moving things that normally are on the page, move those down into, for example, the app bar. And then same with the MS pointer. The ability for, when you hover over something, for it to change its size or highlighting or something, so that you know, particularly with touch, when you're moving your hand over the screen, you get that feedback, you know what you're on. But all of this, you want to consider doing all of this, but at the same time, I would argue that perhaps these in particular you might think twice about, or you might think more on, particularly if we're supporting a web app, and you have an iOS app and an Android app, and now you're building, because you've built the iOS and the Android, now you're building the Windows Store app, because that's how everyone seems to do it. You've got all of these architectures and frameworks that are different. I really believe in code reuse. One of the things that I hope you're understanding in this presentation is you can reuse what you've already created elsewhere. So these things are really good for a Windows Store app, but they don't necessarily translate into other applications or other locations. So if I had a little bit more time, if I wasn't on the project that was taking all my time, I'm certain somebody out there has jQuery add-ins and CSS themes and things like that that are almost as good as what we have for Windows Store applications. Because after all, it is just styling. It's animation, CSS animations. Someone, I'm sure, is going out there figuring out what those are and putting them into packages or frameworks that we can reference and use across the board, so that we have a similar experience across all of our devices, regardless of who makes them. So keep these in mind, but at the same time understand there might be a better way to do it, particularly when we have multiple apps. Finally, some resources. If honestly, if you're a complete beginner, there's excellent resources out there. For Windows Store, you want to go to build.windowsstore. This is probably the kicking, or the start off point for you. They will point you to everywhere else. In particular, they'll point you to the MSDN Dev Center, which is excellent. It has lots of documentation. And if you want a beginner, if you want to go through the tutorials, off of either the Windows Store or the MSDN, there's a series of tutorials called The Basics. And it walks you through each step, installing it, learning about the process, design, develop, and selling it if you so choose. So, great references. definitely, it's easier than you think. The Guild application, the Enterprise Developers Guild application, I did that in a weekend. And it took me about, the overall application was running in less than a weekend, and the styling took me about another week because I really didn't understand. I wasn't very good at styling. I'm a developer. But it's very, very easy to do that. So, on that note, thank you.